The planet of Oakhaven was not a place where history happened. It was a place where history was fed. From the vantage point of the northern ridge, the world was a single, unbroken ocean of gold. The bioengineered wheat, a strain known as Sol 9, grew chest-high and thick, its kernels heavy with enough carbohydrates to sustain a heavy world miner for a week on a single loaf. The wind, relentless and carrying the scent of dry earth and ozone, rippled through the fields in long, shivering waves that stretched all the way to the curved horizon. Above, the sky was a deep, bruising violet, vast and empty save for the silent silver needles of distant trading ships climbing the gravity well, their bellies full of the harvest, bound for the hungry, churning belly of the galactic core. Jonah stood on the porch of his farmhouse, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. He was a man built of sharp angles and slow movements, wearing a canvas jacket that had been patched so many times the original color was a matter of debate. His face was weathered, mapped with the lines of 34 standard years that felt like 60, and his eyes were the color of the soil he turned, dark, patient, and entirely unimpressed by the universe at large. He took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, synthesized from algae paste, but it was hot. That was enough. Out in the south quadrant, 3 autonomous harvesters were working the line. They looked like giant rusted beetles, their anti-grav repulsors humming a low, thrumming bass note that vibrated in the floorboards of the house. One of them, Unit 7, was drifting to the left again. Jonah sighed, the sound escaping him like steam from a vent. He set the mug down on the railing and tapped the comms bead in his ear. Unit 7, adjust yaw 3 degrees north, he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. You are shaving the stalks, not cutting them. Treat the grain with some respect. The machine chirped a binary acknowledgement and corrected its course. Jonah watched it for a moment longer, making sure the cut was clean. He preferred the machines to people. Machines broke in predictable ways. A blown gasket or a fried logic board could be fixed with a wrench and a schematic. People broke in ways that no amount of tinkering could repair. He finished his coffee and walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. He had a schedule to keep. The irrigation pumps in the eastern sector had been throwing pressure warnings since dawn, and if he did not clear the filters before the midday sun hit its peak, the heat would bake the mud into concrete. He walked past the chicken coop, where a dozen genetically hardy hens scratched at the dirt. Morning, ladies, Jonah muttered. Try to lay something bigger than a pebble today, if you please. The hens ignored him. He preferred it that way. Jonah lived on the very edge of the grid, a deliberate ghost in the planetary census. The farmhouse had been his father's, and his father's before that, back when Oakhaven was just a terraforming error that refused to die. Now, it was the breadbasket for 3 sectors. But Jonah kept his distance from the sprawling agri-cities that dotted the equator. He paid his taxes, he met his quotas, and he kept his head down. Inside the workshop, the air was cool and smelled of grease and loam. Jonah pulled up a stool to his workbench, where a disemboweled water pump lay in pieces. He picked up a hydro spanner and began to scrape away the calcified buildup on the intake valve. In the corner, an old holographic projector flickered to life, triggered by a proximity sensor he kept meaning to disable. The blue light washed over the cluttered bench, forming the floating, translucent head of a news anchor from the core systems. The anchor was a polished, synthetic-looking man with teeth that were too white and eyes that blinked too rarely, continuing reports of devastation in the Antares Reach. The anchor said, his voice smooth and urgent. The Crimson Sovereign's forces have reportedly scorched another orbital habitat, leaving 2 million without life support. General Kale, known to her enemies as the Butcher of the Void, has issued no demands. Political analysts suggest this is part of her campaign of resource strangulation, a tactic designed to. Jonah threw the hydro spanner across the room. It clattered against the metal casing of the projector, and the image sparked and died. "Quiet," Jonah said to the empty room. He did not want to hear about the Crimson Sovereign. He did not want to hear about the Empire, or the Trade Federation, or the squabbles of warlords who viewed planets as poker chips and people as collateral damage. He had seen enough of war in his 20s. A brief and regrettable stint in the planetary militia that had cost him the hearing in his left ear and the ability to trust anyone wearing a uniform. He went back to the pump. He scraped the calcium until his knuckles ached. He focused on the simple, tangible reality of the metal. This was his world. If he fixed the pump, the water flowed. If the water flowed, the grain grew. If the grain grew, he survived. It was a simple equation, and he liked simple things. But the universe, it seemed, had a way of complicating even the simplest lives. It started 3 nights later. The day had been grueling. A dust storm had swept in from the equator, clogging the turbine intakes and burying the solar arrays in fine red silt. Jonah had spent 12 hours in an enviro suit, scrubbing panels until his arms felt like lead. He was sitting on the porch, exhausted, watching the twin moons of Oakhaven rise over the fields. The night was quiet, save for the rhythmic whoosh of the turbines turning in the cooling air. Then, the sky tore open. It was not a meteor. Jonah knew the look of a rock burning up in the atmosphere, a quick white scratch against the black. This was different. It was a slow, burning streak of orange and angry red, moving with a heaviness that suggested mass and metal. A deep, sonic boom rolled over the plains, shaking the dust from the porch rafters. Jonah stood up, his hand instinctively going to the rail. The object was coming down hard, trailing smoke and debris. It crossed the horizon line to the west, maybe 10 miles out, over the ridge where the land turned rocky and wild. There was no explosion, just a dull, heavy thud that traveled through the soles of his boots, followed by a tremor that rattled the windows in their frames. A plume of black smoke began to rise against the starlit sky. Thick and oily, Jonah stood there for a long time, watching the smoke twist in the wind. He went inside and stood by the comms console. The emergency frequency was blinking a soft amber light. The automated planetary defense grid had likely tracked the entry. If he pressed the button, he could report the crash. The planetary governor's salvage teams would be here within the hour, followed by customs inspectors, security drones, and bureaucrats with data pads asking why his irrigation permits were 3 years out of date. Jonah's hand hovered over the button. "Nothing good ever comes from officials noticing you," he whispered to the silence of the kitchen. He turned the console off. He convinced himself it was a piece of space junk, or maybe a rogue automated freighter that had blown a thruster. If there were survivors, they would have beacons. If they had beacons, the authorities would already know. It was not his problem. His problem was the fence line in Sector 4, which the dust storm had knocked flat. He went to bed, but he did not sleep. The boom echoed in his memory, a sound like a giant door slamming shut. 2 nights passed. The smoke on the horizon faded, but a strange unease settled over the farm. The animals felt it first. The chickens stopped laying. The farm dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Buster, who usually slept 18 hours a day, spent the nights pacing the perimeter of the yard, growling at the darkness. On the 3rd night, Jonah was out by the north silos. The storm had shorted out the electromagnetic fence that kept the local grazers, 6-legged deer-like creatures called striders, out of the grain. He was kneeling in the dirt, fusing a breaker wire with a soldering iron, the blue spark illuminating his focused face. The air was cold. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Buster, who had been sitting near the truck, suddenly stood up. The hair on the dog's back bristled, standing up in a rigid ridge. He let out a low, vibrating growl that ended in a sharp bark. "Hush, Buster," Jonah said without looking up. "It is just a strider. Let it be." Buster did not hush. He backed away, whining now, his tail tucked between his legs. Jonah paused. He set the soldering iron down. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a heavy, kinetic wrench. It wasn't a weapon, but in the hands of a man who moved rocks for a living, it was close enough. He stood up and turned toward the darkness of the fields. "Who is there?" he called out. His voice sounded flat and loud in the open air. For a moment, there was no answer. Then the grain rustled, not the gentle sway of wind, but the chaotic, tramping sound of something heavy moving through the stalks. Jonah took a step back, his grip tightening on the wrench. "Get off my land. I have automated defenses targeting this sector." It was a lie. His only automated defense was a scarecrow with a broken motion sensor. The rustling stopped. Then, the wheat parted. Jonah's breath hitched in his throat. They emerged from the grain like ghosts rising from a grave. There were 4 of them. They were tall, easily 7 feet, encased in armor that was matte black and scarred by plasma burns. The design was angular, aggressive, with glowing blue veins of light tracing the seams of the metal. They were humanoid, but clearly not human. Their helmets were retracted, revealing skin the color of pale ash, etched with faint geometric tattoos that seemed to shift in the starlight. Their eyes were wide, solid orbs of bioluminescent violet. Soldiers. Jonah had seen vids of Imperial shock troops and Federation Marines. These were neither. These were something older, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. The leader, a towering figure with a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, raised a weapon. It was a heavy pulse rifle design, but the power cell flickered weakly. "Stay where you are, human," the leader rasped. The voice was synthesized, translated by a device at his throat, but the underlying tone was a growl of pure menace. Jonah did not move. He looked at the rifle. It was wavering. The soldier's arm was shaking. He looked closer. The armor, terrifying as it was, hung loosely on their frames. The biomechanical undersuits were torn. The soldier to the left was leaning heavily against a comrade, dragging a leg that looked twisted. Their violet eyes were not glowing with combat rage. They were dimming with exhaustion. They weren't invading. They were dying. "Tell me where the supply cache is," the leader demanded, taking a stumbling step forward. "We know this is an agricultural node. We demand sustenance." Jonah looked at the shaking barrel of the rifle. He looked at the gaunt, hollow cheeks of the alien face. "If you shoot me," Jonah said, his voice surprisingly steady, "you will never figure out how to open the grain locks, and then you will starve to death about 10 feet from a feast." The leader blinked. The threat wavered. The soldier looked at the wrench in Jonah's hand, then back at his own high-tech weapon, as if realizing the absurdity of the standoff. "We will take it by force," the soldier snarled, but there was no heat in it. It was a line recited from a manual, not a promise. "You can try," Jonah said. He lowered the wrench, just an inch. "But that gun looks like it has about 1 charge left. You might get me. But my dog over there, he is fast, and the lock codes die with me." It was another lie. The silos opened with a manual crank if you knew where to kick the panel. The soldier stared at him. The silence stretched. taut as a wire. Then, with a sound of grinding gears, the leader lowered the rifle. The strength seemed to leave him all at once, and he dropped to one knee, the heavy armor crunching into the dirt. "We." The soldier's voice cracked, the translator glitching with static. "We require biological fuel. Please." The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the raw biological imperative of hunger. Jonah looked at them, 4 monsters from the deep black, kneeling in his wheat. He felt a spike of fear, sharp and cold, but it was overridden by a lifetime of instinct. You didn't leave things to die on the farm, not even predators. "Stand up," Jonah said, clipping the wrench back onto his belt, "and keep those weapons pointed at the ground. If you point them at me again, you eat dirt." He turned his back on them, a gesture of trust he did not actually feel, and began to walk toward the barn. "Follow me." The walk to the barn was a slow, shuffling procession. Jonah could hear the heavy metallic footsteps dragging behind him. He kept one hand near his belt, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The barn was a cavernous structure, smelling of dry hay, hydraulic fluid, and aged wood. Jonah hit the lights, and the high sodium bulbs flickered to life, bathing the space in a harsh yellow glow. "Sit," Jonah commanded, pointing to a stack of empty pallets. The soldiers collapsed rather than sat. They huddled together, their armor clinking. They looked absurdly out of place, like war machines parked in a petting zoo. Jonah went to the secure storage locker at the back of the barn. He punched in the code, his wedding anniversary, a date he tried not to think about, and the heavy door hissed open. He bypassed the high-value export grains. He grabbed a crate of field rations he kept for emergencies, dense, brick-like cakes of compressed protein and grain, designed to keep a farmer moving for 18 hours during harvest. He also grabbed a loaf of day-old bread from his own supply and a jug of water. He carried the crate over and set it down on the floor in front of them. "It is rough," Jonah said. "You have to chew it slow, or it will expand in your gut and make you wish you were shot." He tossed the bread to the leader. The alien caught it with reflexes that were dulled but still faster than a human's. He looked at the bread, then at Jonah. Then he tore a chunk off and shoved it into his mouth. The effect was instantaneous. The other 3 soldiers dove for the crate. There was no protocol, no discipline. They tore the wrappers off the protein cakes with trembling fingers. They ate with a desperate, terrifying intensity, their jaws working furiously, crumbs falling onto their pristine black armor. The sound of their eating, wet, frantic, animalistic, filled the quiet barn. Jonah leaned back against a support beam, arms crossed, watching them. It unsettled him. These were creatures built for violence, stripped down to basic biological need. It made them small. It made them tragic. The leader, having finished the bread in 3 bites, cracked open a water canister and drained it in seconds. He wiped his mouth with the back of a gauntleted hand. The violet glow in his eyes seemed to stabilize, burning a little brighter. He looked at Jonah. This time, there was clarity in his gaze. "The sustenance is adequate," the soldier said. The translator smoothed out the rough edges of his voice, but the shame was audible underneath. "You are welcome," Jonah said dryly. The soldier looked down at his hands. "We have failed, Her Majesty. To be reduced to this? Begging a dirt scratcher for scraps. It is a stain on the honor of the vanguard." Jonah's ears pricked up. Vanguard. Her Majesty. The news report from 3 nights ago flashed in his mind. General Kale, the Butcher of the Void. Jonah pushed off the beam and took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Who exactly are you?" Jonah asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. The soldier straightened his spine. a reflex of drilled discipline. We are the 4th reconnaissance unit of the Crimson Sovereign's armada. We are the blade that clears the path. The Crimson Sovereign. The air in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonah looked at the 4 starving creatures. He wasn't feeding refugees. He was feeding the boogeymen. He was feeding the soldiers of a warlord queen who was currently burning her way through the sector. "If you are the Sovereign's troops," Jonah said carefully, keeping his voice level, "why are you starving in my barn? The news says your queen is conquering the Antares Reach. She should have supply lines stretching across the galaxy." The soldier let out a bitter hissing sound that might have been a laugh. "The news is a lie." The soldier spat. "The Antares campaign was a trap. Our supply lines were not cut by the enemy. They were cut from within. Sabotage. The transport fleets never arrived. The jump gates were locked against us." The soldier looked up, and for the first time, Jonah saw genuine anger in the alien's face, not at him, but at something far away. "We were left to rot. Our ships are drifting dead in the void. We crashed here in a scout vessel, seeking anything. Betrayal. The oldest story in the book." Jonah looked at the empty wrappers on the floor. He looked at the soldiers. They were not conquerors right now. They were pawns, discarded tools. He walked over to the barn door and looked out at the night. The farmhouse was dark. The comms console was silent. He had a choice, a terrible, heavy choice. He could walk back into the house, pick up the comms, and call the governor. He would say, "I have a squad of the Crimson Sovereign's troops trapped in my barn." The rewards would be substantial. The governor would pay a bounty that could upgrade the farm's irrigation for a century. The Empire would give him a medal. He would be the hero who captured the monsters. And these 4 soldiers would be dragged out, interrogated, and executed. Or he could say nothing. He could keep feeding them. He could harbor the enemies of the state. If he was caught, it was treason. The penalty for treason was not a trial. It was an orbital bombardment. Jonah looked back at the soldiers. One of them, the youngest-looking one, was carefully folding a ration wrapper, trying to preserve the last crumbs. Jonah thought about his wife, Sarah. He thought about the day the official transport had crashed into their hover car, and how the medics had treated the government official first while Sarah bled out on the pavement. He thought about the sneering face of the governor on the tax broadcasts. He hated the war, but he hated the hypocrites in power more, and he was a farmer. His job was to make things grow, to keep things alive. It went against the grain of his soul to let something die when he had the food to save it. He turned back to the soldiers. "You stay here," Jonah said. "The barn is insulated. Sensors can't scan through the roof." The leader looked at him, suspicious. "You are not summoning the authorities?" Jonah let out a short, humorless laugh. "The authorities would burn my fields just to get a clear shot at you," Jonah said. "I do not want them on my land any more than you do." He pointed a finger at the leader. "But here are the rules. You do not leave this barn. You do not touch my equipment, and you do not hurt my dog. If you break these rules, I will open the silo doors and bury you in 4 tons of wheat. Do you understand?" The soldier hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We understand." "Human. My name is Jonah." Jonah turned and walked out of the barn, sliding the heavy door shut behind him. He locked it. He walked back to the house, his legs feeling heavy. He went into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. His hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the sink, staring out the window at the darkness. "What have you done, Jonah?" he whispered. "You have just invited a war into your living room." He did not sleep that night. He sat in the armchair by the window, watching the barn, waiting for the inevitable arrival of a dropship or a drone. But the night remained quiet. Dawn came slowly. The sky turned from black to a bruised purple, then to a pale, watery gray. The sun began to crest over the eastern ridge, spilling long, golden shadows across the fields. Jonah stood up to start the coffee. He needed caffeine before he figured out how he was going to feed 4 7-foot soldiers without running out of winter stock in a week. He glanced out the window one last time. He froze. On the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun, a figure was walking toward the farmhouse. It was not one of the soldiers from the barn. This figure was alone. It was towering, taller even than the scouts. It wore armor that caught the first rays of the sun and shattered them into a prism of colors. Ornate, terrifying, and beautiful. A long, tattered cape billowed behind it in the morning wind. The figure walked with a stride that did not know the meaning of hesitation. It was a walk of absolute command. Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Crimson Sovereign had come for her lost sheep, and she was walking right to his front door. The sun burned its way over the eastern ridge, turning the morning mist into a haze of liquid gold. It was a beautiful dawn, the kind Jonah usually spent with a mug of coffee and a moment of quiet gratitude for the land. Today, however, the sunrise illuminated an invasion. They had come out of the night like ghosts solidifying into metal and flesh. The 4 scouts from the barn had been merely the vanguard. Now, the main force of the Crimson Sovereign's stranded army had emerged from the crash site beyond the hills, a ragged column of exhausted warriors marching with the last fumes of their discipline. Jonah stood on his porch, his boots scuffed and gray with dust, his faded flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. He did not have a weapon. He had realized, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that if they wanted to kill him, a kinetic wrench was not going to stop them. He stood with his arms loosely crossed, leaning against the wooden pillar of the overhang, watching history walk up his driveway. The figure at the head of the column was impossible to look away from. The queen was taller than any human Jonah had ever met, standing nearly 7 feet. Her armor was a masterpiece of violence and art, plates of iridescent alloy that shifted color from deep violet to razor-edged silver as she moved. But it was battle-worn, scored by plasma burns and dented by impacts that would have pulverized a tank. She removed her helmet as she reached the edge of the yard. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He had expected a monster. He had expected the snarling face of the Butcher of the Void. Instead, he saw a beauty so sharp it felt like a weapon in itself. Her skin was luminous, the color of pale moonlight, patterned with faint geometric markings that looked like metallic tattoos woven directly into her biology. Her eyes were large, tilted, and held irises that fractured light into a spectrum of colors, amber, violet, and green, shifting with her focus. Her hair was a long, heavy braid of silver and black, threaded intricately with fragments of dark armor and small, polished bones. She looked exhausted. Her skin was drawn tight over high, sharp cheekbones, and there was a tremor in her hands that she fought to suppress. But her spine was steel. She walked as if the dirt of his farm was the polished marble of a throne room. Behind her, the soldiers halted. There were hundreds of them visible, perhaps thousands more waiting in the tree line. They were a terrifying sight, a legion of apex predators. Yet they swayed on their feet. Their armor hung loose. The silence in the ranks was not discipline. It was the quiet of creatures too weak to speak. The queen stopped at the foot of the porch stairs. She looked up at Jonah. The height difference was significant, but from his elevated position they were eye to eye. The air between them was thick, charged with a tension that made the hair on Jonah's arm stand up. His dog, Buster, was hiding under the porch, letting out a low, confused whine. Jonah waited. He had no protocol for this. Then, the Queen did something that shattered the world. She shifted her weight, the servos in her leg armor whining in protest, and she lowered herself. One knee, plated in scratched violet metal, hit the bottom wooden step with a heavy thud. She bowed her head, exposing the nape of her neck, a gesture of absolute, suicidal trust. The sound of her armor scraping against the wood was the loudest thing in the universe. "Human farmer feeds starving army," she said. Her voice was a shock, deep, resonant, but raspy with dehydration. It carried a strange, melodic accent, like stones grinding together underwater. "Warlord Queen kneels at his door." The words rippled through the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. A collective gasp, a sound of rustling armor and sharp intakes of breath, swept through the ranks. Heads turned, eyes went wide. To see the Crimson Sovereign, the breaker of star systems, kneeling in the dirt before a human in a flannel shirt was a blasphemy that upended their entire reality. Jonah stood frozen. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the woman kneeling before him, this creature of myth and terror, and he felt a sudden, vertigo-inducing rush of unreality. He did not know if he should be honored or terrified. He suspected he was both. "Please," the Queen said, not looking up. "We require aid. I pledge my life, and the lives of my vanguard, to your service in exchange for sustenance. We have nothing left but our honor. Do not let us die without it." Jonah looked at the soldiers. He saw the way they watched her, not with judgment, but with a sudden, fierce heartbreak. She was stripping herself of all pride to save them. Jonah uncrossed his arms. He rubbed the back of his neck, the stubble scratching his palm. "You can stand up," he said. His voice sounded painfully normal in the heavy silence. "Please, you are making the wood splinter." The Queen looked up. Her multicolored eyes searched his face, looking for mockery. She found none. Slowly, painfully, she rose to her feet. She towered over him again, but the dynamic had shifted. She had opened a door, and he had not slammed it shut. "I do not know how to feed an army," Jonah said, looking past her at the sea of gaunt faces. "I run a high-yield operation, but I am one man with a few automated silos. I don't have the logistics for a legion." "We can ration," the Queen said quickly, stepping onto the first stair. "We can forage. We can hunt. But we need a core source. We need carbohydrates." Jonah let out a short, dry laugh. It was a nervous sound, but it broke the spell of high drama. "Well," Jonah said, "I can't promise a banquet, and I can't promise it will taste good. But I suppose we can start with not letting you die on my property. It is bad for the soil pH." The Queen blinked. For a second, she looked confused. Then, a small, startled sound escaped her lips, a cough that might have been a laugh. Behind her, a few of the soldiers shifted, the tension cracking just enough to let oxygen back into the air. "Start with the barn," Jonah said, pointing. I opened the south silo. It is mostly raw grain, but it is nutrient-dense. Get your people under cover. If a patrol drone flies over, you will look like a very shiny target practice." The Queen nodded. She turned to her troops, her demeanor shifting instantly from supplicant back to commander. "Vanguard!" she barked, her voice regaining its iron edge. "Secure the perimeter. Cloaking protocols on all armor. Lieutenant Vrax, organize ration teams. Priority to the wounded. Move." The army moved. It was a testament to their training that even half dead, they flowed like water. Jonah watched them go, then looked back at the Queen. "Come inside," he said. We need to look at the numbers. The kitchen table was old oak, scarred by decades of knives and hot pans. It was currently covered in holographic maps and manifest lists. The Queen, she had not given a name yet, and Jonah was terrified to ask, stood by the window, while two of her senior officers, tall and silent, huddled over Jonah's datapad. The farmhouse felt ludicrously small with them inside. Their armor clinked against the door frames. Their heads brushed the ceiling beams. The air in the kitchen smelled of ozone, hot metal, and something else, a spicy organic scent that radiated from the Queen herself. "This is the inventory," Jonah said, sliding a digital slate across the table. "I have 3 silos full of Sol 9 wheat. I have 2 greenhouses of hydroponic vegetables, tomatoes, soy, spinach, and I have a cellar of root vegetables. The officer, a scarred alien with 1 cybernetic eye, tapped the slate. He made a clicking sound in his throat. Calculations. The officer rasped. 3,000 combatants. Minimum caloric intake for combat readiness is 4,000 units per cycle. Your reserves provide 2,000 units per combatant for 14 days. 14 days, Jonah repeated. After that, the officer said, the silos are empty. And then we starve, the Queen said from the window. She turned around. The morning light caught the metallic tattoos on her face, making them shimmer. Jonah sat back in his chair. He picked up his coffee mug, realized it was empty, and set it down. 14 days is better than 0 days, Jonah said. In 2 weeks, my automated harvest drones will bring in the eastern fields. That buys us another week. But you are right. The math is bad. We need to contact the fleet, the Queen said. We need to repair the communications array on the scout ship. If you broadcast, Jonah warned, the planetary defense grid will triangulate you. The governor will send bombers, not aid trucks. The Queen's eyes narrowed. Why? Why would your governor deny aid to a stranded vessel? Even in war, there are protocols for distress. Jonah looked at her. She was a warlord, a conqueror of worlds, yet she seemed naive about the pettiness of local bureaucrats. Because, Jonah said, on this planet, food is power. If the governor admits he has lost control of his own borders, he loses his seat. If he captures the famous Crimson Sovereign, he becomes a hero. He doesn't care about distress protocols. He cares about his poll numbers. The Queen stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she walked over to the table. She leaned over the console, her hands bracing on the wood. She was close, very close. Jonah froze. Up close. The detail of her was overwhelming. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He could see the tiny, intricate scratches on her armor. And he could smell that scent again, crushed flowers and charged electricity. It was intoxicating. It triggered a deep, lizard brain reaction in him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with biology. He looked away, staring intently at a map of the irrigation ditches. He felt heat rising up his neck. The Queen paused. She tilted her head, observing him. You are trembling, she said softly. Jonah gripped the edge of the table. I am fine. Do not fear me, farmer, she said. Her voice was gentler now, stripped of the command tone. I am a killer, yes, but I do not kill those who feed me. You are safe in my presence. Jonah looked up. She was looking at him with a mixture of pity and reassurance. She thought he was terrified. She thought he was shaking because he was standing next to a predator. She was wrong. It is not fear, Jonah said. The words came out blunt before he could filter them. The Queen frowned. Then what is it? Jonah met her eyes. The multicolored irises seemed to spin slowly. Look, Jonah said, feeling ridiculous. You are a lot. You are standing in my kitchen wearing tank plating, smelling like a lightning storm in a flower garden. I am a man who talks to corn for a living. Fear isn't the only thing I'm feeling right now." He stopped, horrified at his own mouth. The Queen went very still. She stared at him. Then, slowly, a flush of dark violet color rose up her neck and stained her pale cheeks. It was an unmistakably biological reaction, a blush. She pulled back from the table, standing up straight. She cleared her throat, a sound that sounded surprisingly human. "I see," she said. She smoothed a braid of hair back over her shoulder. Her movements were suddenly less precise, a little flustered. "We should continue the allocation," she said, her voice slightly higher than before. "Right," Jonah said, looking back at the map. Allocation. They worked for hours. The sun climbed high into the sky, baking the roof of the farmhouse. The kitchen became a command center. The dynamic between them shifted. It became a dance of competence. The Queen, she told him to call her command for now, though the soldiers whispered sovereign, was a logistical genius. She could look at a spreadsheet of grain yields and instantly spot the inefficiencies in his distribution network. Jonah, in turn, knew the land. When she suggested moving troops to the northern ridge, he corrected her, explaining the drainage patterns that would turn that ridge into a swamp if it rained. When she suggested rationing water, he showed her how to tap the deep aquifer lines. They fell into a rhythm. She translated the alien metabolic needs. He translated the earth soil capabilities. At one point, they both reached for the holopad to adjust a sector map. Their hands brushed. Her skin was cool, hard, and smooth like polished stone. His was warm, rough, and calloused. The contact lasted only a second, but both of them froze. Jonah felt a jolt go up his arm, a static shock that had no source in the electronics. The Queen's hand hovered over his for a heartbeat longer than necessary before she pulled it away. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. But the air in the kitchen had changed. It was heavier, warmer. "Tell me," the Queen said suddenly, breaking the silence. She was staring at a map of the galaxy displayed on the wall. "Tell me why you live here. You are clearly intelligent. You understand logistics, engineering. Why bury yourself on the edge of the void?" Jonah leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his eyes. "It is quiet," Jonah said. "That is not an answer," she said. "It is the only answer that matters." Jonah replied, "I was married. Sarah, we lived in the city. We were involved in civics, trying to make things better." He paused. The old grief was there, a dull ache in his chest, but it felt distant today, overshadowed by the immediate crisis. "She died," Jonah said simply. "An accident that wasn't really an accident, a transport crash. The officials said it was a malfunction. We knew it was because she asked too many questions about where the tithe money was going." The Queen turned to look at him. Her face was solemn. "So you ran," she said, "not an accusation, a statement." "I retreated," Jonah corrected. "I came back to my father's land. I decided that the galaxy could burn itself down without my help. I just wanted to grow things that don't lie to you." The Queen looked down at her hands. Her armored fingers curled into fists. "I understand," she said softly. "I, too, asked questions." Jonah looked at her. You are the Crimson Sovereign. You are the one burning things down. That is what the news feeds tell you," she said, bitterness coating her voice. She walked over to the window, looking out at her soldiers who were camouflaging the silos with sensor nets. "The Empire is dying," she said. "It is rotting from the inside. The High Council. They have become parasites. They demand expansion, conquest, endless resources, but they do not want to pay for it. She turned to face him. They began using forced conscription, taking children from the outer colonies, using slave labor in the munitions factories. I spoke against it. I told them that a strong empire protects its people. It does not consume them. She laughed, a harsh sound. They called me a traitor. They couldn't execute me, the troops are too loyal. So they sent me to the Antares Reach. They promised supplies, support. It was a lie. They cut the lines. They wanted me to die out there, to starve in the dark so they could turn me into a martyr and use my name to recruit more slaves. Jonah stared at her. The puzzle pieces clicked together with a sickening snap. Resource strangulation, Jonah whispered. The news commentators, controlled conflicts. He stood up and walked to the wall screen. He pulled up the local planetary reports. My governor, Jonah said, his mind racing. He has been increasing the tithes for 3 years. Citing security protocols. He has been shipping grain off-world in unmarked freighters. I thought he was just selling it on the black market. He turned to the Queen. But if he is part of this, if he is aligned with your High Council, then he is not selling it. The Queen finished, her eyes cold. He is stockpiling it, or destroying it, to create artificial scarcity, to keep the populations desperate and obedient. They looked at each other. The barrier of species and culture evaporated. They were two people realizing they were fighting the same invisible monster. So we are both inconveniences, Jonah said. We are loose ends, the Queen corrected, and loose ends are usually cut. Evening fell, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. They walked out to the western ridge. The air was crisp, cooling rapidly. Above them, the sky was putting on a show. The energy leaking from the crashed fleet over the horizon was interacting with the upper atmosphere, creating auroras of neon green and electric blue that danced like spirits. The Queen stood on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping her cape around her legs. She had removed some of her heavy plating, wearing a lighter, flexible undersuit that showed the powerful, lithe musculature of her body. I have never seen a place so peaceful, she said, watching the lights dance. My life has been the interior of ships, the gray of barracks, the red of battlefields. This. Silence. It is loud. Jonah stood beside her, hands in his pockets. You get used to it, he said. She turned to him. The aurora light reflected in her eyes, making them look like galaxies. Why did you do it? She asked. Do what? Feed us. Open your door. You knew who I was. You knew the risk. Logic dictated you should have reported us or fled on. Why feed the enemy? Jonah looked out at the fields. The grain was rustling softly in the dark. He thought about the soldiers in the barn, the way they had eaten the bread, the way they had looked at her when she knelt. I don't know, Jonah admitted. Maybe I'm just stupid. He looked at her. But I don't see starving bodies as enemies first. I see them as things that are broken. And on a farm, when something is broken, you fix it. You don't ask who broke it. You just fix it. The Queen stared at him. Her expression crumbled. The hard, imperious mask of the Warlord slipped, revealing a woman who was profoundly, devastatingly lonely. Compassion, she whispered, as if testing the word in a foreign language. It is a dangerous strategic flaw. Maybe, Jonah said, but it is the only strategy that lets you sleep at night. She looked at him for a long time. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. She didn't move to brush it away. You are a strange man, Jonah, she said. And you are a strange warlord, Your Majesty. She smiled. It was a real smile this time, small, but genuine. The night ended in the kitchen. They shared a meal, a stew Jonah had thrown together from root vegetables and dried beef. The queen ate with dignity, but he could see the hunger still lurking in the speed of her spoon. They sat at the small table, opposite each other. The farmhouse was quiet. The soldiers were outside, keeping watch. It was just the two of them in the pool of yellow light. The space under the table was cramped. Jonah shifted his legs and his knee bumped against hers. It was an electric jolt. He pulled back, apologizing. "Sorry." "Don't move," she said quietly. She didn't pull her leg away. She left it there, her knee pressing firmly against his. The contact was through layers of cloth and flexible armor, but it felt incredibly intimate. It was a grounding point, an anchor. They finished the meal in silence, but the silence was not empty. It was full of words they were afraid to say. Jonah cleared the plates. When he came back to the table, she was standing up. "I must return to my troops," she said. "I need to oversee the night rotations." "Right," Jonah said. "Of course." She walked to the door. Then she stopped. She turned back to him. She stepped closer. The scent of ozone and flowers washed over him again. Stronger this time. She reached out a hand. Her fingers, long and tipped with sharp, black nails, hovered inches from his face. She looked at his jawline, at the stubble, at his lips. Jonah stopped breathing. He stood perfectly still, his heart thundering in his ears. He wanted her to touch him. He wanted it with a sudden, fierce ache that terrified him. Her eyes searched his. They were wide, dark, and full of a raw, confusing hunger that mirrored his own. She took a breath. Her fingers trembled slightly in the air. Then, she pulled her hand back. She clenched it into a fist at her side. "Good night, Jonah," she said, her voice tight. "Good night," he whispered. She turned and walked out into the night, the door clicking shut behind her. Jonah stood in the kitchen, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading away. He touched his own face where her hand had almost been. His skin felt hot. He realized, with a sinking sensation, that his quiet, simple life was over. The war had not just come to his doorstep, it had just walked out of his kitchen, and God help him, he wanted it to come back in. The broadcast began at noon, interrupting the automated weather report on Jonah's kitchen console. The screen flickered from a diagram of humidity levels to the polished, heavy-jowled face of planetary Governor Harlan Vane. Vane sat behind a desk of rare mahogany, a flag of the Empire draped artfully behind him. He looked grave, the kind of practiced seriousness that politicians wore like a tailored suit. "Citizens of Oakhaven," Vane began, his voice smooth as oil. "We have received disturbing intelligence regarding hostile alien elements in the northern sectors. These are dangerous insurgents, remnants of the Crimson Sovereign's fractured command. A security lockdown is now in effect for all agricultural zones." Jonah stood by the stove, stirring a pot of synthesized oatmeal. Beside him, the queen, who had taken to leaning against the counter as if it were a tactical map table, watched the screen with eyes that burned like cold stellar fire. "Report any unusual activity immediately," Vane continued. "Do not approach these creatures. They are desperate, savage, and without honor. Security drones have been deployed. For your safety, stay indoors." The screen went black, then returned to the weather report. "Savage and without honor," the queen repeated quietly. She looked down at her hands, which were currently holding a mug of coffee Jonah had pressed upon her. "He is projecting," Jonah said, turning off the burner. "Vane wouldn't know honor if it bit him on the nose. But he does know how to cause trouble. He is not looking for insurgents. He is looking for witnesses to bury." The lockdown changed everything. The farm, once a sanctuary of isolation, became a cage. The sky, usually a vast canvas of blue, was now punctuated by the distant buzzing whine of surveillance drones. They looked like black wasps against the clouds, scanning the fields with thermal optics and motion sensors. "We have to move the supplies," Jonah said, laying out a sketch of the farm on the table. "If they scan the south silo and see the heat signature of 3,000 soldiers, the game is over. We need to disperse your people into the irrigation tunnels and the old storm cellar under the orchard." The Queen looked at the sketch. "The tunnels are narrow," she noted. "It will be tight." "It is better than being dead," Jonah said. The next 3 nights became a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. They moved only when the moons were obscured by clouds. Jonah taught the alien elite, warriors who had stormed orbital fortresses, how to move like farmers. He showed them how to weave thermal blankets from the husks of harvested grain to mask their body heat. He taught them to walk in the furrows of the plowed earth to avoid creating silhouettes against the horizon. He even rigged a series of electromagnetic jammers using parts from broken tractors and old microwave emitters, creating pockets of static that blinded the drones just long enough for a squad to dash from the barn to the orchard. It was exhausting, terrifying work. But in the midst of the tension, something unexpected began to grow. Humor. It started on Tuesday afternoon. Jonah was in the lower paddock, trying to fix a fence post that had rotted through. He had assigned 2 of the Queen's personal guards to help him, massive, hulking soldiers named Korg and Vex, who were accustomed to wielding plasma cannons, not post-hole diggers. Korg, a warrior who stood 7 feet tall and had scars that looked like lightning bolts across his face, was currently engaged in a standoff. The opponent was Barnaby, Jonah's prize-winning and exceptionally ill-tempered goat. Barnaby stood on his hind legs, bleating furiously, blocking Korg's path to the tool shed. Korg, holding a shovel like a battle axe, looked genuinely uncertain. "Creature," Korg rumbled, his voice synthesizer deepening the threat. "Stand aside. I am a Praetorian of the Vanguard. I have slain void beasts." Barnaby responded by lowering his head and charging. He slammed his horns into Korg's armored shin with a dull clang. Korg yelped, a high, startled sound, and scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Do not engage," Vex shouted, raising a hammer. "It is a biological trap." Jonah, watching from the fence line, leaned against a post and started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sight of 2 galactic killing machines being routed by a 30-pound goat was the most ridiculous thing he had ever seen. The Queen, who had been supervising from the porch, walked down the steps to see what the commotion was. She saw Korg hiding behind the water trough while Barnaby chewed triumphantly on the handle of the shovel. She stopped, her eyes widened, and then a sound escaped her that stopped the soldiers in their tracks. She laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a full, throaty laugh that shook her shoulders and made her armor chime softly. She laughed until she had to lean against the fence for support, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Korg," she gasped, pointing at the terrified giant. "You are afraid of the livestock." Korg looked at his queen, then at the goat, then back at his queen. He slowly lowered the shovel handle. "It has evil eyes, Your Majesty," Korg mumbled, sounding deeply ashamed. Jonah walked over, still chuckling. He patted Barnaby on the head, which the goat accepted with smug satisfaction. "He just wants a treat," Jonah said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a dried apple slice. He tossed it to the goat, who crunched it happily and trotted away. "See?" Jonah said to Korg. "Diplomacy." The Queen looked at Jonah, Her face was flushed, her eyes bright and crinkled at the corners. The mask of the warlord was gone completely, replaced by something softer, lighter. "I have not laughed like that in cycles," she admitted, her voice warm. "Thank you, Jonah." Jonah felt a strange tightness in his chest. "You are welcome," he said. "Just maybe don't put Korg in charge of the petting zoo." The laughter was a turning point. The soldiers relaxed. They began to see Jonah not just as a resource, but as a person. They started helping with chores without being asked, clumsily, yes, but with earnest effort. One soldier was found attempting to salute the autonomous tractor every time it passed him. Another spent hours fascinated by the chickens, gently feeding them grain one kernel at a time. But the nights were still dangerous. On the fourth night, they were in the kitchen again. The windows were blacked out with heavy shutters. The only light came from the holographic map table, which was currently flickering as the farm's solar batteries struggled to keep up with the alien encryption software running on the Queen's datapad. They were hunting for the truth. The Queen had managed to salvage a communications module from the crashed scout ship. They were using it to intercept local transmissions, filtering through the noise of the planetary net. "Look here," the Queen said, pointing a long, dark finger at a stream of data scrolling down the display. "This is a shipping manifest from the governor's private orbital dock." Jonah leaned in. He had to stand close to her to see the fine print. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. He felt the hum of her bio-augments, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in his own bones. He tried to focus on the numbers. 300 tons of grain. Jonah read, "Destination, Vector 79. That is deep space. That is not a trade route. It is a rendezvous point," the Queen said. Her voice was low, intimate in the quiet room. She tapped a few keys. "Look at the receiver code. House Varric." Jonah stiffened. "Varric. That is Counselor Varric. He is one of the most powerful men in the sector. And he is the one who proposed the resource restrictions," the Queen said, her voice turning cold. "He claimed there was a shortage. He claimed we needed to tighten our belts for the war effort." She looked at Jonah. Her face was inches from his. The blue light of the map illuminated the sharp planes of her cheekbones and the depth of her multicolored eyes. "He is stealing the food," she whispered. "He creates the shortage by hoarding the supply, drives up the prices, starves the outer rim, and uses the chaos to justify more military spending. My army, my people. We were just an obstacle he needed to remove so he could control the trade routes." Jonah felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. But beneath it, he felt the magnetic pull of her presence. She smelled of rain and charged metal. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "They are monsters," Jonah said softly. "Yes," she agreed. "And we are the only ones who know." They stared at each other. The political revelation faded into the background, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming fact of their proximity. Jonah's gaze dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. He saw the pupils dilate. The air between them felt thick, like the atmosphere before a storm. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to touch the strange, metallic markings on her skin. "Jonah," she started, her voice breathless. A siren shattered the moment. It was the proximity alarm Jonah had rigged on the perimeter fence. It screamed through the house, a high, piercing wail. Jonah pulled back, the spell broken. He grabbed the datapad and killed the lights. "What is it?" the Queen asked, her voice instantly shifting back to command mode. "Drones?" "No," Jonah said, rushing to the window and peering through a crack in the shutter. "Drones don't set off the ground sensors." He saw lights on the horizon, Not the soft glow of a sunrise, but the harsh, erratic beams of searchlights. Vehicles were tearing through the wheat, crushing the stalks. He heard the roar of engines, heavy combustion engines, not the smooth hum of imperial tech. Mercenaries. Jonah spat. Raiders. Vane must have hired off-worlders to do his dirty work. He wants to burn us out. The Queen grabbed her helmet from the table. It slid into place with a hiss of pressurization. Vanguard, she roared into her internal comms. Defensive positions. We are under attack. The farmhouse exploded into activity. Jonah grabbed his kinetic wrench and a hunting rifle he kept in the closet. It was a slug thrower, ancient by galactic standards, but it fired explosive rounds that could punch through light vehicle plating. Get to the barn, Jonah yelled. They will try to target the silos first. They burst out the back door into chaos. The night was lit by tracers. The mercenaries were coming in fast on hover skiffs and light walkers, bipedal machines with autocannons mounted on their chassis. They were firing indiscriminately, setting the dry fields ablaze. The smell of burning grain was instant and choking. They are trying to flush us out, the Queen shouted over the roar of an explosion that took out the chicken coop. Jonah felt a pang of loss for the hens, but he shoved it down. They are heavy, Jonah said, watching a walker struggle in the soft earth of the lower field. They don't know the terrain. He grabbed the Queen's arm. The irrigation lines, Jonah shouted. I can blow the pressure valves in Sector 4. It will turn that whole field into a mud pit. Those walkers will sink like stones. Do it, the Queen commanded. Jonah ran. He sprinted toward the pump station, ducking low as a line of plasma fire chewed up the dirt to his left. He could hear the Queen behind him, her voice ringing out orders, directing her starving soldiers with the precision of a conductor. Cover fire on the left flank. Vrax, take the high ground, suppress those skiffs. Jonah reached the pump station. He slammed the override code into the panel. Pressure release. He gasped. Maximum flow. The ground shook, with a roar like a dying dragon. The main irrigation pipe in the south field burst. Millions of gallons of pressurized water erupted from the ground, instantly flooding the area where 3 mercenary walkers were advancing. The result was catastrophic for the attackers. The dry earth turned to soup in seconds. The heavy walkers lost their footing, sliding and tipping over, their legs flailing uselessly in the muck. Now! The Queen screamed. From the darkness of the grain silos, her vanguard emerged. They were weakened, hungry, and exhausted, but they were the Crimson Sovereign's elite. They moved with terrifying speed. Plasma bolts lit up the night. Energy blades hummed to life, casting long purple shadows. Jonah watched from the pump station, mesmerized. The Queen was a blur of motion. She had drawn a weapon he had not seen before, a double-ended glaive of pure energy. She moved through the mercenaries like a scythe through wheat. She leaped onto the hull of a crashed walker, spun, and sliced the cannon barrel clean off. She was terrifying. She was magnificent. Jonah fired his rifle, taking out a mercenary who was trying to flank her. The recoil bruised his shoulder, but he didn't feel it. He was running on pure adrenaline. Jonah, look out! The Queen's voice cut through the noise. Jonah turned. A mercenary skiff had swung around the barn, its spotlight blinding him. A rocket pod on its side hissed as it armed. He froze. There was no time to run. Then, a blur of violet and silver slammed into him. The Queen hit him at full speed, tackling him off the raised platform of the pump station. They fell together, tangling in the air, just as the rocket struck the station. The explosion was deafening. Heat washed over them, a physical wave of force. They slammed into the drainage ditch below, rolling through the mud and dry grass. They came to a stop at the bottom, pinned against the earth. Jonah gasped, trying to get air into his winded lungs. He was lying on his back. The queen was on top of him, her weight heavy and solid. Her helmet had been knocked loose in the fall, revealing her face. There was a smear of blue alien blood on her cheek. Her hair was wild, escaping its braids. Her armor was smoking, the metal hot against his chest. "Are you intact?" she rasped, her eyes wide and frantic, scanning his face for injuries. Jonah nodded, unable to speak. He could feel her heart hammering against his own, a rapid, thundering rhythm through the cracked plating of her chest piece. She didn't move. She stayed there, straddling him, her hands gripping the dirt on either side of his head. The battle raged above them, shouts, explosions, the whine of engines, but in the ditch, there was only the two of them. The adrenaline was a drug in his veins. It sharpened everything. The smell of her, smoke, ozone, and that intoxicating floral musk filled his senses. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. The fear in her eyes shifted, it darkened, it became something else entirely, something hot, something hungry. There was no thought process, no decision. It was as inevitable as gravity. She made a small, desperate sound in her throat and leaned down. Jonah reached up, his hands grabbing the hot metal of her shoulder plates, pulling her down. Their lips met with a crash. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was fierce, messy, and desperate. It tasted of dust and blood and static electricity. Her mouth was hot, her teeth grazing his lip. He felt the vibration of her throat as she groaned against him. He gripped her armor, his fingers finding the gaps in the plating, touching the undersuit, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. She responded with equal force, one hand tangling in his hair, the other pressing his shoulder into the mud. It was a release of days of tension, of fear, of two people from different worlds finding the only solid thing in a universe that was falling apart. It felt wrong by every rule of logic and politics. It felt like treason. It felt like madness. And it was the most right thing Jonah had ever felt. They broke apart, gasping for air, chests heaving. They stared at each other, stunned. The queen's lips were swollen, her eyes blown wide with shock. Jonah felt like he had been plugged into a fusion reactor. She started, her voice shaking. That was strategic error. Jonah managed to wheeze, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She rested her forehead against his for a second, closing her eyes. "Calculated risk," she whispered. She pushed herself up, grabbing her helmet from the mud. The mask of command slid back into place, but her hands were trembling. "We have a battle to finish," she said. "Right," Jonah said, sitting up and grabbing his rifle. "After you, Your Majesty." The rest of the fight was a blur, with the walkers disabled and their leader taken out by Korg, who had seemingly gotten over his fear of aggressive mammals. The mercenaries broke and ran. They fled back into the night, leaving burning wreckage in their wake. But victory had a cost. Smoke drifted across the fields as dawn approached. The fire in the south sector had been contained, but 5 acres of grain were ash. Near the barn, the bodies were laid out, 7 mercenaries, and 2 of the Queen's vanguard. One of them was the young soldier who had liked feeding the chickens. His squad mate, a female warrior with intricate facial tattoos, was kneeling beside the body, letting out a low, keening wail that sounded like tearing metal. The Queen stood nearby, her shoulders slumped. She looked lost. In her world, death was a statistic. You mourned, but you moved on. You honored the sacrifice, but you did not dwell on the loss. But here, on the farm, death felt different. It felt personal. Jonah walked over to her. He gently touched her elbow. "Go to her," Jonah said softly. The Queen looked at him. What do I say? He died for the Empire. He died with honor. That is the protocol. Protocol doesn't help when you are hurting, Jonah said. Just tell her you are sorry. Tell her you will miss him too. The Queen hesitated. Then she walked over to the kneeling soldier. She knelt down in the dirt, ignoring the stains on her armor. She didn't give a speech. She didn't talk about glory. She simply placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder. I am sorry, Vora, the Queen said quietly. He was a good soldier, and he was a good friend. We will carry his memory. The soldier looked up, surprised by the softness in her warlord's voice. She leaned into the Queen's touch, weeping openly. Jonah watched them. He saw the Queen's face tighten, saw her swallow hard to keep her own composure. She was learning. She was breaking. Yes, but she was breaking open. An hour later, Jonah stood in the farmhouse kitchen. He was covered in mud, soot, and alien blood. He walked to the comms console. He bypassed the safety protocols and patched directly into the governor's private frequency, the one they had found in the data stream. It took a minute, but the connection clicked through. Governor Vane's face appeared on the screen. He looked disheveled, clearly woken from sleep by the priority alert. Who is this? Vane demanded. How did you get this frequency? Good morning. Harlan, Jonah said, leaning into the camera. Vane squinted. You are that farmer. Sector 9. That is me, Jonah said. I just wanted to call and thank you. Thank me? Vane looked confused. For the demolition crew you sent, Jonah said, his voice hard as diamond. They were a bit sloppy. They missed the barn, and they missed me. But don't worry. I cleaned up the mess. Vane's face went pale. You are harboring them. You are a traitor to the crown. I will have you vaporized. I will have that farm turned into glass. You can try, Jonah said. But Harlan? I know about the grain shipments. I know about Counselor Varric. And I have the manifests. Vane went silent. His eyes darted back and forth. If you send one more drone, one more soldier, or one more hired gun, Jonah said, I will broadcast those manifests to every news outlet from here to the core. I will tell the galaxy exactly how you and your friends manufactured a famine. He leaned closer. Do not test me. I am just a farmer, but I have some very angry friends with very big guns. He cut the feed. Jonah leaned back against the counter, exhaling a long breath. His hands were shaking again. You just declared war on the planetary government, a voice said from the doorway. The Queen was standing there. She had cleaned the blood off her face, but the bruise on her cheek was dark purple. She wasn't wearing her armor anymore, just the undersuit. She looked smaller, more human. Someone had to do it, Jonah said. She walked into the room. She stopped in front of him. The memory of the kiss in the ditch hung between them, electric and undeniable. We cannot stay here, Jonah, she said. I know, he said. Vane is scared, but he is not stupid. She continued. He will not attack with troops again. He will use orbital bombardment. He will wipe this grid square off the map to destroy the evidence. We have maybe 24 hours. Jonah looked around the kitchen. This was his home, his father's home. Every scratch in the floorboards had a story. So we run? He asked. No, the Queen said. We do not run. We attack. She pulled up the data pad. My scout ship is damaged, but the shuttle is intact. It has stealth capabilities. We can slip past the blockade. And go where? To the source, she said. To the High Council. We take the evidence directly to the tribunal on Station Ethelgard. We expose Varric. We expose the conspiracy. It is the only way to clear my name, and it is the only way to save your world from these parasites. She stepped closer. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm. "I am leaving at sunset," she said. "My troops will scatter into the wilderness to wait for my signal. But I need to go." She looked into his eyes. "Come with me." "Jonah." Jonah stared at her. "Leave the farm. Leave the only thing he had ever known." "I am a farmer," he said weakly. "I grow wheat. I don't fight councils." "You are more than a farmer," she said, with fierce conviction in her voice. "You are a strategist. You are a leader. And—" She squeezed his hand. "And you are the only one who sees me. Not the warlord, not the monster, just me." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I cannot do this without you. I do not want to do this without you. Come with me, not as a hostage, not as a guide, but as my ally, as my partner." Jonah looked at their joined hands, the human skin against the alien markings, dirt and starlight mixed together. He looked out the window at the fields. They were scorched, burned, scarred, but the roots were still there. They would grow back, but if he stayed, he died, and she died. He looked back at her, at the woman who had knelt at his door, the woman who had laughed at a goat, the woman who had kissed him in a muddy ditch while the world burned. He squeezed her hand back. "Well," Jonah said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I suppose the harvest is done anyway. And I have always wanted to see a space station." The Queen smiled. It was blinding. "Pack your bag, farmer," she said. "We have a galaxy to save." The bag was small, canvas, and smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and dried sage. Jonah zipped it shut, the sound tearing through the silence of the bedroom like a ripping seam. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the room. It was a space defined by absence, the empty side of the bed where the sheets were always crisp, the vanity table that still held a single dust-covered bottle of Sarah's perfume, the window that framed the western fields, the view he had woken up to for 34 years. Leaving felt like an amputation. It was a physical ache in his chest, a heaviness in his gut that had nothing to do with the stale air of the house. He was not just leaving a property. He was leaving his history. He was leaving the ghosts that kept him company. He picked up the bag. It was light. A few changes of clothes, a data pad, a multi-tool, and a small sealed packet of seeds, Sol 9 wheat, the best yield he had ever engineered. If he died out there in the black, at least he would have a bit of home in his pocket. Jonah walked out onto the porch. The afternoon sun was heavy and golden, casting long shadows across the yard. The Queen was waiting by the gate. She had stripped off the bulk of her heavy combat plating, wearing a streamlined, dark gray flight suit armored with flexible ceramic scales. She looked like a shadow cut from the night sky. She was checking the charge on a plasma pistol, her movements precise and mechanical, but Jonah could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. She was vibrating with a restless energy, like a predator trapped in a cage. She looked up as the screen door slammed shut. Her multicolored eyes swept over him, taking in the bag, his worn jacket, the grim set of his jaw. "You are ready," she stated. It was not a question. "I am packed," Jonah corrected. "Being ready is a different thing entirely." She holstered the pistol. "The shuttle is prepped. The canyon launch window is narrow. If we wait, the patrol drones will shift their orbit to the zenith, and we will be spotted." Jonah nodded. He walked past her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I need 5 minutes." The Queen opened her mouth to argue, to cite efficiency and risk. But she stopped. She saw the look in his eyes. It was not hesitation. It was a need for a funeral rite. "Take 10, she said softly. Jonah walked into the fields. The wheat was tall, golden, and swaying in the gentle wind. He walked down the central irrigation row, running his hand along the tops of the stalks. The bristles scratched his palm, a familiar rough texture that grounded him. He stopped at the junction of the north sector, the spot where the soil was richest, where he had buried his father's ashes 20 years ago. He knelt down. He dug his fingers into the earth, feeling the cool dampness of the soil beneath the dry crust. "I am sorry," he whispered to the land. "I have to leave you wild for a while. Don't let the weeds win." He stayed there for a minute, breathing in the scent of growth and decay, memorizing the hum of the wind turbines and the distant cry of a scavenger bird. He was trying to imprint this world onto his soul, layering it over the scars of his past so he wouldn't forget who he was when the universe tried to turn him into something else. He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. When he turned, the Queen was there. She was standing 10 yards back, watching him. She had followed him silently, her boots making no sound on the earth. Her expression was unguarded, a mixture of confusion and a strange, hollow longing. "You touch the dirt like it is a lover," she said. Her voice was low, carrying over the rustle of the grain. "It is the only thing that stays," Jonah said. "People leave, governments fall, but the land stays. You treat it right, it feeds you. You treat it wrong, it kills you. It is honest." The Queen looked down at the wheat stalks brushing against her armored leggings. She reached out a hand, mimicking his motion, but her touch was hesitant, stiff. She pulled her hand back as if the plant might bite. "I have burned fields like this," she confessed, "to deny the enemy cover, to break their supply lines. I never thought about the hands that planted them." She looked up at him. The sunlight caught the metallic tattoos on her face, turning them into veins of gold. "I am taking you away from this," she said. "I am dragging you into a world of steel and vacuum and lies. You should hate me for it." Jonah walked over to her. He stopped a foot away. The proximity was dizzying. "I don't hate you," he said. "I am terrified, yes, but I don't hate you." "Terrified of the danger?" she asked. "Terrified of losing myself," he answered honestly. "I know who I am here. I am Jonah the farmer. Out there, with you, I don't know who I am. I am afraid I will just become another casualty in your war, or another weapon." The Queen stepped closer. The air between them crackled with the static charge of her presence. "And I am afraid too." "Jonah," she whispered. He looked at her, surprised. "You?" "The Crimson Sovereign is afraid." She did not smile. "I am not afraid of death. I have died a dozen times in simulations and nearly as many in reality. I am afraid of this." She gestured vaguely between them. "Softness," she said, the words sounding like a curse. "Desire, doubt. You make me ask questions I cannot answer. You make me want to put down the sword. And a warlord who puts down her sword is just a target." She looked away, her gaze fixing on the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip. "I have never had a mate, Jonah, not a true one." The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. "My life has been a series of strategic alliances," she continued, her voice devoid of self-pity but full of cold fact. "Genetic compatibility matches for the strongest bloodlines. Political unions to secure a flank or a trade route. I was bred to be a symbol, not a woman. I do not know how to be with someone I actually want. I do not know the protocols for affection." She looked back at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "I might break you, Jonah, or I might break myself trying to hold you." Jonah felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at this woman, this terrifying, powerful, beautiful creature who could command armies but didn't know how to hold a hand without analyzing the strategic implications. He stepped into her space. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, encased in the flexible armor, but they tightened around his instantly. "We are not a strategy," Jonah said gently, "and we are not a political alliance." "Then what are we?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jonah squeezed her hand. "We are two people in a lot of trouble," he said, "and if we both survive this, we will figure the rest out. One day at a time, just like farming. You plant the seed, and you see what grows." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She found only the steady, patient gaze of a man who waited for seasons to turn. "One day at a time," she repeated. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. The vulnerability vanished behind the mask of the commander, but her hand remained in his. "Come," she said. "The sun is setting. We leave now." The shuttle was hidden in the Devil's Throat, a narrow, winding canyon 3 miles north of the farm. It was a battered, ugly thing, a surplus cargo hauler that had been retrofitted with military engines and a stealth drive. It looked like a flying brick that had been kicked down a flight of stairs. They scrambled up the ramp as the first stars began to blink into existence. The interior was cramped, smelling of recycled air and old coolant. "Strap in," the Queen ordered, sliding into the pilot's seat. Her fingers flew across the console, waking the dormant systems. Jonah buckled himself into the co-pilot's chair. The harness was designed for someone with a broader chest and an extra set of ribs, so it dug into his collarbone. "Initiating stealth drive," she announced, damping thermal signature, engines to 40%. The shuttle shuddered. With a groan of protesting metal, it lifted off the canyon floor. Jonah looked out the viewport. The farm was a patchwork quilt of dark fields and silver irrigation lines. He saw the farmhouse, a tiny speck of light in the growing darkness. He saw the barn. He saw the life he was leaving behind. A lump formed in his throat, hot and painful. He watched until the farm was just a blur, until the clouds swallowed it, until the sky turned from blue to the black of the void. He felt a hand on his arm. He turned. The Queen was not looking at the controls. She was looking at him. Her expression was fierce, possessive, and apologetic all at once. "Don't look back," she said softly. "Look at me. I am your horizon now." Jonah looked at her. He saw the reflection of the stars in her eyes. He took a breath, held it, and let the farm go. "I am looking," he said. The journey to Station Ethelgard was a 3-day crawl through jump points and backwater drift lanes to avoid Imperial patrols. The shuttle was not built for comfort. It was a utility vehicle, which meant the sleeping quarters were a single bunk bed bolted to the wall of the cargo hold, and the galley was a dispenser that produced gray sludge and hot water. On the second morning, Jonah decided to attempt civilization. He found a packet of instant coffee in his bag, real Arabica, a luxury he saved for special occasions. He brewed 2 cups using the hot water dispenser. The smell filled the cramped cabin, rich and earthy. He walked into the cockpit where the Queen was monitoring the sensor array. "Breakfast," he said, handing her a mug. She looked at the steaming black liquid suspiciously. "Is this a nutrient supplement?" she asked. "It is coffee," Jonah said, taking a sip of his own. "It is essential for human function. It makes the morning tolerable." She sniffed it. "It smells like burnt dirt. Try it." She took a tentative sip. Her eyes went wide. She swallowed, then immediately coughed, a violent hacking sound. She stared at the cup as if it had betrayed her. "By the void," she wheezed. "It tastes like liquid anxiety. How do you drink this?" "My heart rate just spiked 20 beats per minute." Jonah laughed, leaning against the bulkhead. "It is an acquired taste," he admitted. "It is poison," she declared, handing the cup back to him with 2 fingers. "No wonder your species is so restless. You voluntarily ingest toxins to wake up." "We call it motivation," Jonah said, finishing his cup. "If my empire discovered this," she muttered, wiping her mouth, "we would not invade you. We would quarantine you." The humor was a shield. It kept the reality of their situation at bay. But the physical reality of the shuttle was harder to ignore. The quarters were impossibly tight. When they moved through the corridor connecting the cockpit to the cargo hold, they had to turn sideways to pass each other. Every time they passed, there was a moment of friction, her hip brushing his thigh, his shoulder grazing her arm. The heat of her body was palpable in the cool air of the ship. They slept in shifts to avoid the single bunk, but the overlap was inevitable. Jonah would wake up to the sound of the shower unit running, the thin metal walls doing nothing to dampen the noise. He would lie in the darkness, imagining the water running over her scars, her tattoos. When she emerged, wrapped in a thermal towel, the air in the cabin would become thick and heavy. They would exchange awkward murmurs, avoiding eye contact, terrified that one wrong look would ignite the fuel vapor that seemed to fill the room. It was a torture of proximity. They were 2 magnets held apart by a thin sheet of resolve. On the 3rd night, the universe decided to intervene. They were passing through the ion cloud of an unstable nebula when the proximity alarm blared. "Solar flare!" The Queen shouted from the cockpit. "Brace for impact!" The ship lurched violently. The artificial gravity generator whined, sputtered, and died. Jonah was thrown upward. His stomach dropped as weightlessness took hold. The contents of the cabin, data pads, tools, his coffee mug, floated into the air in a chaotic cloud. The emergency lights bathed the ship in a pulsing crimson glow. "Jonah!" the Queen called out. "I am here," he said, pushing off the ceiling and drifting toward the cockpit. She was floating near the pilot's chair, trying to reboot the gravity drive. She had unstrapped to reach the manual breakers. The ship rolled. Jonah lost his grip on the bulkhead and tumbled through the air. He collided with her. It was a soft impact, slowed by the lack of gravity. His chest hit her back. Reflexively, his arms went around her waist to anchor them both. She grabbed his forearms to steady herself. They floated there, suspended in the red dark, turning slowly in the center of the cockpit. Jonah could feel every inch of her against him, the curve of her spine, the strength of her core, the warmth radiating through her flight suit. Her hair, unbraided for sleep, floated around them like a silver halo, strands of it brushing against his face, tickling his nose. She turned in his arms, twisting her body so she was facing him. She didn't let go. Her legs wrapped loosely around his, her boots hooking behind his calves to keep them locked together. They stared at each other. The red light made her eyes look dark, bottomless. "Are you injured?" she whispered. Her voice was breathless. "No," Jonah said. His voice sounded wrecked. He looked at her mouth. It was inches away. She raised a hand. Her fingers drifted through the air and touched his jaw. Her skin was cool, but her touch burned. She traced the line of his stubble, her thumb resting on his lower lip. "Jonah." She breathed. She pulled him closer. There was no gravity to fight, only the magnetic pull of their own desire. He tangled his fingers in her floating hair, gripping the back of her head. He could feel her breath on his face. Sweet and fast, She tilted her head. Her eyelids fluttered shut. They were going to kiss. And if they kissed now, floating in the dark with the universe locked out, they would not stop. They would tear each other apart. Jonah froze. A sudden cold clarity pierced the fog of lust. If they did this now, they would lose the edge. They were flying into a pit of vipers. They needed to be sharp. They needed to be desperate. If they satisfied this hunger, they might become complacent. Or worse, they might become so terrified of losing each other that they would hesitate when the firing started. He pulled back. Just an inch. "Not here," Jonah whispered. His voice was rough, agonizing. "Not like this." The Queen's eyes snapped open. She looked confused, then hurt, then understanding. She saw the resolve in his eyes. She saw the cost of it. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath. She rested her forehead against his chin. "You are right," she whispered. "Focus. We need focus." She untangled her legs from his. She pushed gently against his chest, creating a drift between them. But the separation was painful. It was a physical tearing. "When this is over," she said, her voice fierce and low, staring at him with a promise that made his knees weak even in 0G. "When the war is done, Jonah, I will not be noble, and I will not be restrained." Jonah looked at her, floating in the red light, a goddess of war promising him oblivion. "I am counting on it," he said. Station Ethelgard was a sore on the side of the galaxy. It was a massive rotating torus of rusted metal and neon lights, a hub for smugglers, independent traders, and the corrupt bureaucracy of the fringe sectors. They docked in a lower maintenance bay, bribing the automated controller with a spoofed Imperial override code. They moved through the station in hoods and cloaks. The Queen moved with a hunched posture, hiding her height, her distinctive armor concealed under a heavy scavenger's poncho. Jonah looked like exactly what he was, a rough-edged worker from the rim. The station smelled of ozone, frying oil, and unwashed bodies. It was loud, a cacophony of alien languages and thumping industrial music. "We need a terminal," the Queen murmured, "a secure hardline. And we need to meet my contact." The contact was a Celestian dockmaster named Vrix, who operated out of a back room in a noodle bar called the Rusty Sprocket. Vrix was nervous. He kept wiping his large, watery eyes with a rag. "You shouldn't be here." "Sovereign," Vrix hissed, looking at the door. "There are bounties. Big ones. The guilds are looking for you. The Empire is looking for you. Even the pirates are looking for you. We need the shipping logs." "Vrix," the Queen said, placing a heavy bag of platinum iridium coins on the table. "The private hangars. House Varric." Vrix hesitated. He looked at the money. He looked at the Queen's hooded face. "It is suicide," he muttered. "But business is bad under the new tariffs." He slid a data chip across the table. Jonah took the chip. He plugged it into his datapad. The screen filled with spreadsheets, rows and columns of numbers. To a soldier, it was boring. To a farmer who spent his nights balancing fertilizer costs against crop yields, it was a language he spoke fluently. Jonah scrolled. His eyes narrowed. "Here," he said, pointing to a column. "Look at the dates." The Queen leaned in. "What am I seeing?" "Pattern recognition," Jonah said. "Every time there is a reported rebellion or pirate raid in a sector, look at the grain shipments 2 weeks prior." He highlighted the data. The shipments stop, completely, 2 weeks before the conflict starts. He scrolled to another sector. And here, the Antares Reach. Shipments stopped a month before your troops were deployed. They create the famine first. The hunger causes the unrest. The unrest justifies the military intervention. And look at the recovery phase, Jonah continued, his voice growing cold. Once the military, your military, clears the sector, the shipments resume, but at triple the price. And look who holds the exclusive contract for the relief aid. He tapped a name on the screen, Varric Interstellar Logistics. The Queen stared at the screen. Her hands were shaking. They used me, she whispered. The realization was a physical blow. She sank onto a stool, the fight draining out of her. I thought I was bringing order. I thought I was securing the empire. I was just the breaker bar. I broke the doors down so they could loot the house. She looked up at Jonah, her eyes brimming with tears of pure, molten rage. They called me the butcher, she hissed, but they are the ones eating the meat. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. It was a silent, terrible sobbing, the sound of a worldview shattering. Jonah stepped in. He ignored the nervous dockmaster. He ignored the crowded bar outside. He put his hands on her shoulders. He pulled her hands away from her face. Look at me, he commanded softly. She looked at him. She looked broken. You are not them, Jonah said firmly. You were the weapon, yes, but you were a weapon wielded by a liar. That is not your shame to carry. That is theirs. But I pulled the trigger. She choked out, I burned the worlds. And now you are going to burn the liars, Jonah said. You are going to take that name, the Crimson Sovereign, and you are going to shove it down their throats. You are going to show them what a real warlord does when she finds out she has been played. He brushed a thumb over her cheek, wiping away a tear that was silver in the neon light. You are not the myth they built, Kyle. You are the woman who knelt at a door to feed her people. That is who you are. Do not forget it. She stared at him. She breathed in his conviction, drawing strength from his absolute certainty. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. The fire was back. It was colder now, sharper. You are right, she said. She stood up. The poncho fell back, revealing the glint of her armor. Vrix, she said to the terrified dockmaster. We need a transmitter, broad spectrum, something that can hit the core worlds without being jammed. Vrix pointed a shaking finger toward the upper levels. The spire, the main comms array, but it is guarded. Imperial stormtroopers. The Queen pulled her helmet from her bag. She slid it over her head, the faceplate sealed with a hiss, hiding her tears, hiding her doubt. Let them come. The synthesized voice of the Crimson Sovereign growled. I have a message to send. She turned to Jonah. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and squeezed his hand. A thank you. A promise. Jonah squeezed back. He checked the charge on his kinetic wrench. Let's go start a riot, Jonah said. They moved toward the door, stepping out of the shadows of the underbelly and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the station, carrying a truth that was about to set the galaxy on fire. And for the first time, Jonah didn't look back at where he had come from. He only looked forward, at the armored figure leading the way. The explosion did not sound like a boom. It sounded like the universe cracking open. One moment. Jonah was standing before the tribunal of Ethelgard, a semicircular array of 3 judges hovering in anti-grav pods, clutching the data chip that contained the proof of the conspiracy. The Queen stood beside him, her head held high, radiating the cold dignity of the Crimson Sovereign. The next moment, the world turned white. The shockwave threw Jonah backward. He slammed into a marble pillar, the breath leaving his lungs in a painful wheeze. Glass from the observation dome shattered, raining down like diamond hail. Dust, thick and tasting of pulverized stone, filled the air instantly. Jonah! The Queen's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. She was there, pulling him up. Her personal shield generator was flickering, a dying amber sphere that had absorbed the worst of the blast. "We have to move," she shouted, her voice raw. Through the clearing smoke, Jonah saw the tribunal pods. They were gone, replaced by a jagged crater in the floor. Security drones, painted in the black and gold of the Imperial Guard, were pouring through the breached blast doors, their weapons raised. The broadcast speakers, miraculously still functioning, crackled to life. "Attention. The rogue warlord Kyle has attacked the judiciary. She is to be considered armed and extremely hostile. Kill on sight." They killed the judges. Jonah coughed, stumbling as she dragged him toward a service corridor. "And they are blaming you." "It is efficient," the Queen growled, shoving a drone aside with a blast of telekinetic force from her gauntlet. "I would admire it if I were not the target." They ran. The station was a labyrinth of neon-lit corridors, now flashing with red emergency strobes. Laser fire chewed up the walls behind them. The Queen's small band of loyalists, 4 guards who had accompanied them, returned fire, covering their retreat. They were trapped. The main hangars were blocked by a phalanx of heavy troopers. The elevators were locked down. "We are cut off," a guard yelled, ducking behind a vending kiosk as plasma bolts melted the metal. Jonah looked around. They were in a maintenance sector. He saw the layout with the eyes of a man who fixed things for a living. He saw the color-coded pipes running along the ceiling. Yellow for power, blue for water, brown for... "There," Jonah said, pointing to a heavy circular hatch on the floor. "That is a waste chute," the guard sneered, firing a burst of suppression rounds. "It leads to the incinerators. It leads to the recycling plant in the lower sector," Jonah corrected. "I checked the schematics. It is a gravity drop. It is sewage," the guard argued. "It is an exit," Jonah shouted. He grabbed the wheel of the hatch. It was rusted stuck. He kicked it, hard, finding the leverage point just like he did with the stubborn grain silos back home. The metal shrieked and gave way. The hatch swung open, releasing a smell that made the Queen's eyes water. "Into the hole," Jonah ordered. The Queen did not hesitate. She looked at the approaching stormtroopers, then at the foul-smelling darkness. "I hate this revolution," she muttered, and jumped. They slid down the chute, a terrifying, twisting slide through slick metal tubes, landing in a pile of semi-processed bio-sludge. They waded through the muck, Jonah leading them through the maze of filtration systems, bypassing the security checkpoints that only monitored the clean, well-lit hallways above. They emerged an hour later in the auxiliary docking bay, covered in filth but alive. The Queen's flagship, a massive dreadnought named the Sovereign's Will, was docked there, its engines idling with a deep, subsonic thrum. They boarded under the cover of steam venting from the recycling plant. As they walked up the ramp, the Queen wiped a smear of grime from her face. "You have a talent for finding the most undignified path to survival," she said. Jonah wrung out his sleeve. "Fertilizer is fertilizer, Your Majesty. It all washes off." But the filth on the outside was nothing compared to the rot on the inside. The atmosphere on the Sovereign's Will was poisonous. As they marched to the bridge, crew members stopped and stared. They didn't salute. They whispered. They looked at the Queen, their invincible warlord, covered in waste, walking beside a human in a torn jacket. In the war room, the tension snapped. The room was dominated by a massive tactical table. Around it stood the Queen's senior officers. Half of them looked relieved to see her. The other half looked like they were watching a train wreck. Sub-Commander Rax, a scarred veteran with pale, chitinous skin, slammed his hand on the table. "This is madness," Rax shouted, pointing a clawed finger at Jonah. "You bring a human onto the bridge? A dirt scratcher? And now the news feeds say you bombed the tribunal? The fleet is fracturing. Kale, half the captains are threatening to mutiny. They are confused, the Queen said, her voice icy calm despite her appearance. They are being fed lies. They see their queen led on a leash by a mammal. Rax spat. Look at you. You are compromised. You have let your affections cloud your judgment. You are destroying the vanguard for a pet. The silence that followed was absolute. The other officers held their breath. To speak to the sovereign that way was usually a death sentence. Jonah stood by the door. He felt the weight of every stare. He felt small. He felt like the foreign contaminant Rax said he was. He stepped forward, opening his mouth to offer to leave, to de-escalate. But the Queen moved first. She stepped into Rax's personal space. She did not draw a weapon. She simply loomed, her presence filling the room like a thunderhead. Compromised? She asked softly. She gestured to Jonah without looking at him. When the Empire cut our lines, who fed you? Rax blinked. The farmer. When the High Council left you to rot in the Antares Reach, who opened his silos? Who gave you bread when your own government gave you silence? Rax looked down. This pet, as you call him, has more honor in his dirt-stained fingernails than the entire High Council has in their golden robes. The Queen's voice rose, ringing off the metal walls. He risked his life. He risked his home. He is the only reason you are standing here to insult him instead of starving in a ditch on Oakhaven. She swept her gaze across the room, challenging every officer. I have not lost my mind. I have found my clarity. The Empire betrayed us. This human saved us. If that is a weakness, then I am proud to be weak. But if any of you wish to test my strength, draw your weapon now. No one moved. The shame in the room was palpable. Rax swallowed hard, then slowly brought his fist to his chest in a salute. Forgive me. Sovereign, he murmured. The Queen held his gaze for a second longer, then turned. Clear the room, she ordered. I need to think. The officers filed out. Jonah and the Queen were left alone in the hum of the tactical display. Jonah exhaled, leaning against the table. That was dramatic. She slumped, the adrenaline leaving her. She looked tired. She looked human. It was necessary, she said. But Rax is right about one thing. We are losing them. The propaganda is working. They need a victory. Jonah. Or I will lose this ship. She looked at him. Are you regretting it? Jonah looked at the holographic star map. He thought of his quiet porch. He thought of the smell of rain on dry earth. Part of me wants to run, he admitted. Part of me wants to hide in a cargo crate and go back to being a nobody. He walked over to her. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the metallic knuckles of her gauntlet. But I can't, he said. I can't walk away from the truth. And I can't walk away from you. She looked up at him. The gratitude in her eyes was blinding. Come, she said softly. Let us find a moment of peace before the galaxy tries to kill us again. The observation deck was a bubble of glass at the spine of the ship. Outside, the nebula swirled in ribbons of violet and gold, a storm of creation that made the war feel insignificant. The room was dim, lit only by the starlight. The Queen had finally removed her armor. She wore a simple body glove of soft, dark fabric. Without the plating, she looked smaller but also more real. The lines of her body were strong, athletic, but curved in ways the armor hid. They stood by the glass watching the stars. I never thought I would see this view without looking for targets. The Queen said, I was raised to see the universe as a series of threats to be neutralized. And I was raised to see it as a calendar, Jonah said. Planting season, harvest season, storm season. He turned to her. "What happens if we win?" he asked. She shook her head. "I do not know. I have never planned past the next battle." "Maybe," Jonah said, stepping closer. "You could try a different kind of life. There is a lot of empty land on Oakhaven. It needs work." She laughed, a low, husky sound. "The Warlord Kale? Pulling weeds?" "You have the grip strength for it," Jonah teased. He reached out and touched a lock of her hair. It was free of the braids now, falling in a silver curtain around her face. She went still. She turned to face him fully. The humor faded, replaced by the same intense magnetic pull that had drawn them together in the ditch. But this was different. There was no adrenaline now, no explosions, just them. "Jonah," she whispered. She reached out and placed her hands on his waist. Her palms were warm. He stepped in. He slid his hands into her hair, cupping the back of her head. He felt the ridges of the faint metallic markings that ran down her neck. They kissed. It was slow, deliberate. It was a question and an answer. Her lips were soft, tasting of the sweet tea they had shared in the mess hall. He deepened the kiss, and she made a sound in her throat, a surrender. She pulled him toward the small couch in the corner of the room. They moved together, a tangle of limbs and breathless whispers. It was awkward at first. The clasps of her body glove were foreign to him, intricate magnetic locks that required a specific touch. She laughed softly against his neck as he fumbled, guiding his hands with her own. "Patience." "Farmer," she murmured, her breath hot on his skin. "It is not a puzzle box." When the suit peeled away, he saw the map of her life. Her skin was a canvas of silver scars, plasma burns, blade marks, the history of 100 battles. He traced a long, jagged scar on her ribs with his fingertips. "This one?" he asked. "Battle of Crixus," she whispered, shivering at his touch. "I was careless." He kissed the scar. "You are beautiful." She stiffened, then melted. She had been worshipped as a warrior, feared as a killer, but never held as a woman. She reached for him, pulling his shirt over his head, her hands exploring the pale, unscarred skin of his back, the muscles built by labor, not war. They lay together under the light of the nebula. It was not the frantic, desperate coupling of the ditch. It was a slow exploration. It was the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone pass the defenses. "I am afraid," she admitted into the dark, her head resting on his chest. "I know," Jonah said, stroking her hair. "Me too." But as the night wore on, the fear was replaced by a fierce, burning connection. They were two lonely things that had found their match. And as they fell asleep, limbs tangled, the silence of the room was not empty. It was full. Morning brought a new ease between them. They moved around the small cabin with a domestic familiarity. He handed her a data pad. She tossed him his boots. There was no need for words. The bond was forged. It was solid, but the universe did not wait for lovers. A priority channel opened on the bridge. It was a message from the High Council. "A peace summit," Rax announced, looking skeptical. "They are inviting you to the moon of Tython, neutral ground. They say they want to negotiate terms for the resource reforms." "It is a trap," Jonah said immediately. "Of course it is," the Queen agreed, buckling her armor. "But it is a public trap. They are broadcasting it live to the entire sector to prove their goodwill. If I go," she continued, eyes narrowing, "I can use their own broadcast against them. I can present the evidence to the galaxy, live, before they can cut the feed." "It is risky," Jonah said. "It is the only move we have," she replied. "If we hide, We look like the terrorists they say we are. If we show up, we force their hand. Jonah looked at her. He saw the resolve. Then I am coming with you, he said. You are a civilian. She argued. I am a witness, he corrected. You have the data. I have the story. People trust farmers. They don't trust warlords. You need me. She looked at him. She touched his cheek. I do need you, she said. The moon of Tython was a desolate rock terraformed into a garden of white stone and glass. The summit was held in a massive amphitheater, surrounded by the flags of the member worlds. The conspirators were there. Counselor Varric sat at the center of the dais, looking like a benevolent grandfather in his white robes. The queen stood in the center of the arena, flanked by her guards. Jonah stood beside her, wearing his simple farm clothes, a deliberate choice. Varric smiled. Lady Kale, he said, his voice amplified across the moon. You have caused quite a stir. Bombings, theft, treason. But we are forgiving. Surrender your fleet, and we will grant you a fair trial. I do not want your forgiveness. Varric, the queen declared, her voice booming. I want the truth, she signaled Rax. The massive holographic display above the arena flickered. The data from the stolen chip appeared. The grain manifests, the dates of the famines, the profits of Varric's company. This is the truth, the queen shouted. You starve your own people to fuel your wars. The crowd, dignitaries, reporters, diplomats murmured. Varric's smile didn't waver. Fabrications, Varric said smoothly. Easy to fake. Then hear the witness. The queen gestured to Jonah. Jonah stepped forward. He felt the cameras on him. Billions of eyes. My name is Jonah, he said. His voice shook slightly, then steadied. I am a wheat farmer from Oakhaven. I don't know about politics, but I know what hunger looks like. He looked directly at the camera. I saw the soldiers of the Crimson Sovereign. They didn't come to conquer. They came begging for bread. They were starving. And while they starved, I watched grain shipments leave my planet, bound for Varric's private warehouses. I saw the orders signed by his office. He pointed at Varric. He is not a statesman. He is a thief, and he is killing you for profit. The silence in the arena was profound. The truth, spoken plainly, had a weight that cut through the spin. Varric's smile vanished. He tapped a control on his podium. A touching story, Varric said, his voice cold. But let us see the real nature of your relationship with this creature. The holographic screen changed. The data vanished. In its place, a video began to play. It was footage of Jonah and the Queen. But it was twisted. It showed them in the farmhouse, but the audio was doctored. The Queen's voice was manipulated to sound threatening, commanding. Jonah's voice was edited to sound submissive, terrified. Kneel, human, the digital Queen snarled. Yes, mistress, the digital Jonah whimpered. Then images flashed, graphic, doctored images suggesting a perverse slave-master relationship. It was designed to play on every xenophobic fear of the human populace. It painted the Queen not as a lover, but as a predator who had enslaved a weak-minded human. The human is her pet, Varric shouted, standing up. She has brainwashed him. She is a monster who seduces and enslaves. The crowd erupted. Disgust and anger rippled through the stands. The sympathy Jonah had built evaporated instantly. Lies! The Queen roared, reaching for her weapon. That was the signal. Security forces, hundreds of them, poured into the arena. Protect the human victim, Varric ordered. They swarmed. The Queen's guards formed a circle, firing outwards. It was chaos. Screams. Laser fire. The flash of grenades. Jonah was shoved backward by the crush of bodies. He tried to stay with the Queen, but a shock baton slammed into his ribs. Jonah! The queen screamed, reaching for him. A heavy trooper tackled Jonah. He hit the ground hard. Hands grabbed him, dragging him away from the circle of defense. Let him go! The queen bellowed, her energy glaive igniting with a crackle of violet lightning. She cut down 2 troopers, desperate to reach him. Hold fire! Varric's voice boomed. The shooting stopped. The queen froze. She stood in the center of the carnage, her weapon raised, her chest heaving. Look. Kale, Varric said. The holographic screen changed again. It showed a live feed. Jonah was on his knees backstage, blood running down his forehead. A soldier held a disruptor pistol to his temple. Drop the weapon, Varric said pleasantly. Or the farmer dies. Live. In high definition. The queen stared at the screen. She looked at Jonah. Jonah met her eyes through the camera. He shook his head slightly. Don't do it, he mouthed. The queen's hand trembled. If she surrendered, she died. Her revolution died. But if she fought... She looked at Varric. You promise his safety? She asked, her voice hollow. You have my word, Varric lied. The queen looked back at the screen one last time. She saw the fear in Jonah's eyes, not for himself, but for her. She slowly deactivated her glaive. The violet blade vanished. She dropped the hilt. It clattered on the white stone. Kneel, Varric commanded. The queen stood tall for a second. She looked at the flags of the empire she had served. She looked at the faces of the people who hated her. Then, she bent her knees. She sank down to the stone floor. She bowed her head. The crowd cheered. Varric looked triumphant, but on the ground, hidden by the curtain of her falling hair, the queen's eyes were not defeated. They were burning with a cold, terrifying calculation. She was kneeling, but she remembered what Jonah had told her in the farmhouse. Sometimes the bravest thing a ruler can do is kneel, and sometimes kneeling is just a way to get closer to the detonator. She closed her eyes and began to hum a sequence, a code, not for a weapon she carried, but for a seed she had planted long ago. The farmer was captured. The queen was in chains, but the harvest was just beginning. The holding cell smelled of ozone and stale fear. It was a sterile white box defined not by walls but by a shimmering curtain of high-frequency energy that hummed with a sound like a migraine made audible. Jonah sat on the cold metal floor, his back resting against the rear bulkhead. He was bruised. His left eye was swollen shut, a souvenir from the shock baton, and his ribs ached with every breath. But his hands, resting on his knees, were steady. Beyond the energy curtain, 2 guards stood watch. They were mercenaries wearing the expensive, polished armor of Varric's private security detail. They were laughing. I am telling you, one guard said, adjusting his rifle strap. The feeds are calling him the Peasant King. Can you believe it? People actually think this dirt scratcher seduced the sovereign. The other guard snorted. It is a myth. Varric says the queen used neural binding tech on him. He is just a victim. A pathetic little human who got caught in the gears of history. Jonah closed his good eye. He tuned them out. Instead, he focused on a memory. He remembered the smell of the kitchen on Oakhaven. He remembered the steam rising from a ceramic mug. He remembered Coil, the Crimson Sovereign, the Butcher of the Void, scrunching up her nose at the taste of coffee and calling it poison. He remembered the shy, fractured smile she had given him when he teased her. They thought he was a victim. They thought he was broken. Jonah opened his eye. He looked at the energy barrier. It was strong. It was military grade, but it ran on a circuit, and every circuit had a breaker. He had spent his whole life afraid of the wider galaxy. He had hidden on his farm, thinking that if he kept his head down, the war wouldn't touch him. but he realized now that the fear was the cage, and he was done with cages. And if I die today, Jonah thought, watching the guards, I am going to die standing up. And I am going to make sure these corporate thugs remember exactly what a dirt scratcher can do. High above the detention block, in the grand amphitheater of the moon of Tython, the stage was set for an execution disguised as justice. The queen knelt in the center of the arena. Heavy magnetic shackles bound her wrists and ankles. She was stripped of her weapons, her cape, and her dignity. She was surrounded by a ring of Varric's elite troopers, their weapons leveled at her chest. In the VIP boxes, the galaxy's elite watched. Cameras hovered like vultures, beaming the image to trillions of screens. Counselor Varric stood at the podium, basking in the glow of the spotlights. "Behold the monster," Varric intoned, his voice amplified to a godlike boom. "The Crimson Sovereign, she who starved worlds, she who bombed our courts, she who enslaved an innocent human to mask her ambition. Today, we end her reign of terror. Today, justice is served." The queen looked up. Her face was bruised, but her eyes were dry. She looked at the camera drone hovering in front of her. She knew Jonah was watching, wherever they were holding him. She felt the cold metal of the shackles against her skin. But beneath the undersuit of her armor, pressed against her ribs, she felt something else. A small, hard lump. It was a device. A crude, ugly little thing they had built together in the cargo hold of the shuttle. It was made from the inhibitor chip of a harvest drone, a coil of copper wire, and the power core of a plasma grenade. It was a piece of farm technology jury-rigged with alien military hardware. Jonah had called it the System Shock. It was designed to do one thing: dump a massive, chaotic electromagnetic pulse into the local grid. It wouldn't kill anyone, but it would confuse the hell out of anything with a microchip. Varric raised his hand. "Executioners, prepare." The troopers raised their rifles. The hum of charging capacitors filled the silence. The queen took a deep breath. She looked directly into the lens of the camera drone. Her lips curved into a small, terrifying smile. She whispered the activation phrase, the code they had joked about in the dark, the private language of their unlikely union. "Liquid anxiety," she said. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the device against her ribs detonated. It was not an explosion of fire, but of invisible force. A ripple of distortion slammed outward from the queen's body. The lights in the amphitheater died instantly. The camera drones fell out of the sky, crashing onto the stone floor. The magnetic shackles on the queen's wrists sparked and released with a dead clank. The troopers' rifles, advanced weapons filled with targeting computers, whined and shut down. A collective gasp went up from the audience as the arena plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint red glow of emergency chemical lights. In the detention block, the world turned upside down. The hum of the energy curtain sputtered and died. The barrier vanished. The lights went out, plunging the cell into absolute blackness. The two guards outside the cell panicked, their night vision visors, dependent on power, blacked out, blinding them. "My HUD is dead," one shouted. "I can't see." Jonah didn't need a HUD. He knew darkness. He had worked fields at midnight when the storms knocked out the grid. He knew how to move by feel, by sound, by instinct. He moved. He lunged out of the cell. He didn't try to fight like a soldier. He fought like a man who wrangled 1,000-pound livestock. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the first guard. It was a tackle born of pure leverage. The same move he used to knock over a recalcitrant heifer. The guard, blind and top-heavy in his armor, went down with a crash of metal. The second guard spun around, swinging his rifle wildly in the dark. "Who is there?" he screamed. Jonah reached out. His hand found the barrel of the rifle. He yanked it downward, using the guard's own momentum to pull him off balance. Then, he brought his other hand down, not a fist, but a heavy, open palm, striking the junction where the helmet met the armor. The guard crumpled. Jonah stood over them, panting. He reached down and grabbed the magnetic keycard from the first guard's belt. It was useless now without power. But the rifle was a heavy club. He took it. He ran into the corridor. The emergency lights flickered on, dim, blood-red strobes that turned the hallway into a nightmare tunnel. Alarm klaxons began to blare, a low mechanical moan powered by backup generators. Jonah ran toward the upper levels. He knew the layout from the schematics they had stolen. He had to get to the arena. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a wall of muscle. It was Korg. The massive alien soldier was standing in the hallway, holding a piece of a metal table he had ripped from the floor. "Farmer?" Korg grunted, his violet eyes glowing in the red dark. "Korg," Jonah gasped. "You are free." "The cages failed," Korg said, a toothy grin spreading across his face. "The Queen's signal. The Vanguard is awake." Down the hall, sounds of combat erupted. Shouts, the clash of metal on metal. The Queen's loyalists, stripped of their energy weapons, were fighting the mercenaries hand to hand. Jonah hefted the dead rifle like a bat. "Let's go find her," Jonah said. They moved through the chaos. It was a brutal, ugly fight. The sophisticated weaponry of the Empire was useless. This wasn't a Star War anymore, it was a brawl. Jonah fought with a grim, terrifying efficiency. When a mercenary tried to block his path, Jonah didn't duel him. He swung the rifle stock into the man's knee, shattering the joint, then shoved him into a wall. It was the pragmatism of the harvest. Remove the obstacle, move to the next row. He saw a young alien soldier being cornered by two mercenaries with stun batons. Jonah didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it. It slammed into the first mercenary's helmet. Korg finished the second one with a backhand that sent him flying. "Nice throw," Korg noted. "It is all in the wrist," Jonah muttered. They reached the doors of the grand amphitheater. They were locked, the heavy blast seals engaged. "Stand back," Korg rumbled. The giant alien backed up, roared, and threw his shoulder into the doors. They groaned but held. "Together," Jonah shouted. He jammed the barrel of his rifle into the seam of the doors, using it as a pry bar. Korg pushed. Jonah levered. With a shriek of tearing metal, the doors popped open. They spilled into the arena. The scene was apocalyptic. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. The crowd of dignitaries was screaming, scrambling for the exits. In the center of the pit, a swirling melee was underway. And in the eye of the storm was the Queen. She was unarmed, unarmored, and magnificent. She moved like liquid shadow. She used the mercenary's own weight against them, disarming a trooper, spinning him around to block a blow from another. She was dancing the dance of war, and she was winning. Jonah spotted her instantly. "Kale!" he shouted. She spun around, across the chaotic sea of fighting bodies, their eyes locked. She saw him, bloodied, holding a broken rifle, standing beside her giant lieutenant. He saw her, wild hair, fierce eyes, alive. The relief that washed over her face was so raw it hit Jonah like a physical blow. "Jonah!" she cried out, her voice cutting through the noise. She kicked a mercenary away and sprinted toward him. He ran to meet her. They collided in the center of the arena. He dropped the rifle and grabbed her arms. She grabbed his face, her hands shaking. "You are alive," she breathed. "So are you," he gasped. "Nice light show." "We have to finish this," she said, pulling back but keeping her hand on his arm. "Varric. He is trying to flee to his shuttle." Jonah looked up at the dais. Varric was surrounded by his personal guard, retreating toward a rear exit. "Go," Jonah said. I have your back. They fought their way up the stairs of the dais. It was the farmer and the warlord, side by side. When a guard swung a blade at the queen, Jonah blocked it with the rifle stock. When a guard aimed a backup pistol at Jonah, the queen shattered his wrist with a precise kick. They reached the top. Varric was fumbling with the manual release of the blast door. He turned as they approached. His face was pale, sweating in the red light. He pulled a small, gold-plated pistol from his robes, a holdout weapon, mechanical, unaffected by the EMP. "Stay back!" Varric screamed, aiming the gun at the queen. "I will kill you! I will kill you all!" The queen stopped. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at Varric with an expression of profound pity. "You still do not understand, do you?" she said softly. She took a step forward. "The power is gone. Varric," she said, "the lies are gone. It is just you and the truth." Varric's hand shook. "Shoot her!" he screamed to his guards. But his guards didn't shoot. They looked at the queen. They looked at the farmer standing beside her, bruised and defiant. They looked at Varric, sweating and cowardly. They lowered their weapons. "Traitors!" Varric shrieked. Jonah stepped forward. "Give me the gun! Harlan!" Varric swung the pistol toward Jonah. "You peasant! You ruined everything!" Jonah didn't flinch. "You ruined yourself. You thought you could eat the world and never get full?" Jonah moved. It was fast, faster than a politician expected a farmer to be. He slapped the gun aside and grabbed Varric by the collar of his white robe. He slammed the counselor against the wall. Varric gasped. The wind knocked out of him. Jonah held him there. He could feel the rage pulsing in his hands. He could end it right here, snap his neck, end the threat. He looked at the queen. She was watching him. She wasn't stopping him. She was letting him choose. Jonah took a breath. He loosened his grip. "No," Jonah said. "That is too easy for you." He turned to the queen. "Is the broadcast still live?" "The EMP fried the cameras," she said. "But the emergency audio channel is open. It broadcasts to every receiver in the system for safety alerts." Jonah dragged Varric over to the podium. He ripped the microphone from its stand. It was a hardened line, still crackling with static. He shoved the mic into Varric's face. "Tell them," Jonah commanded. "I have nothing to say," Varric stammered. Jonah twisted Varric's arm behind his back, applying just enough pressure to make the counselor yelp. "Tell them about the grain," Jonah said into the mic. "Tell them about the artificial shortage. Tell them about the profit margins." Varric looked at the angry crowd freezing in the arena below. He looked at the queen's soldiers closing in. Varric's voice trembled over the speakers. "I authorized the diversions." "Louder!" the queen commanded. "I diverted the food!" Varric screamed. "Breaking! We created the famine. We needed the war to drive up the prices. It was business. It was just business." The confession echoed through the station. It echoed through the comms of the ships in orbit. It echoed on the news feeds that were frantically switching to audio backup. The silence that followed was heavy. Jonah released Varric. The counselor slid to the floor, weeping. "It wasn't business," Jonah said, his voice carrying over the speakers. "It was breakfast. And you took it from people who were hungry." He dropped the microphone. The queen stepped forward. She looked down at Varric, then out at the galaxy, listening in the dark. She reached up and unclasped the heavy ceremonial collar of her rank. She let it fall to the floor with a clang. "I am done with warlords," she announced. "The Crimson Sovereign is dead. From this day forward, the Vanguard serves no council. We serve the hungry. We serve the weak." She looked at Jonah. "We will rebuild what was broken. We will open the supply lines, and if anyone tries to close them again..." She let the threat hang, heavy and absolute. The crowd in the arena didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They began to clap, a slow, steady rhythm that grew into a roar. It wasn't the applause of a spectacle. It was the sound of agreement. In the days that followed, the galaxy changed. Not all at once, and not easily. But the truth, once out, could not be put back in the box. Varric and his co-conspirators were arrested, not by the Queen but by their own security forces who refused to protect them any longer. A new interim council was formed. They offered Jonah everything: a governorship, a knighthood, a seat at the high table of the new republic. Jonah sat in a plush office on the station, listening to the offer from a nervous diplomat. "I appreciate the gesture," Jonah said, standing up and picking up his battered canvas bag. "But I am not a politician. I don't know how to sit in meetings." "But you are a hero," the diplomat insisted. "You can name your price." "I have a price," Jonah said. He walked to the window and looked out at the stars. "I want a guarantee. Fair trade prices for the outer rim, no tariffs on seed, and open borders for relief ships." "Done," the diplomat said. "But what for yourself?" Jonah smiled. "I just want a ride home. My harvest is late. The seasons turned on Oakhaven. The scars on the land healed. The burnt fields were tilled under, the ash mixing with the soil to feed the new growth. 2 years had passed since the summit of Tython. The farm was different now. The silence was still there. But it wasn't lonely. There were new buildings, a larger barn, a community center down the road where alien refugees and human settlers learned to graft Terran roots onto native soil. Jonah stood on the porch. He was older. There was a bit more gray in his beard. But his eyes were clear. He watched the sunset painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange. A shuttle descended from the clouds. It wasn't a warship. It was a sleek, unarmed transport painted in the colors of the Vanguard Relief Corps, white and gold. It landed in the West Paddock. Jonah didn't run. He walked down the steps, coffee mug in hand, and waited by the gate. The ramp lowered. Kale walked down. She was different too. The heavy, terrifying battle plate was gone. She wore a light ceremonial armor of polished silver and leather, functional but not aggressive. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. She moved with the same grace, but the tension, the coiled spring of the predator, was gone. She stopped at the gate. She looked at the farmhouse. She looked at the fields, heavy with golden wheat. She looked at him. "The galaxy is noisy," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "I miss the quiet." Jonah smiled. He opened the gate. "It is only quiet because the tractor is broken again," he said. "I was hoping you could fix it." "You are good with engines," she laughed, a bright, free sound. "I command a fleet of 10,000 relief ships." "Jonah, I negotiate treaties with star systems, and then you want me to fix a tractor?" Jonah shrugged. "It is a very important tractor." She walked up to him. She stopped inches away. The scent of ozone and flowers was still there. The scent of home. She reached out and wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek. Her touch was gentle, lingering. "I have missed you, farmer," she whispered. "I missed you too, Your Majesty," he replied. "It is just Kale," she corrected. Kale. He tested the name. It sounded good. They walked up to the house together. They didn't rush. They walked side by side, their hands brushing, then intertwining. They stopped in the doorway, the place where it had all begun. She looked down at the wooden planks of the porch. "I remember," she said softly. "I knelt right there. I thought it was the end of my life." Jonah pulled her close. His arm went around her waist, pulling her against him. She rested her head on his shoulder, fitting there perfectly. It wasn't the end, Jonah said. It was the planting. She looked up at him. Her multicolored eyes shone with unshed tears. You taught me that power isn't about how many people you can kill, she said. It is about how many people you can feed. You taught me that a queen can kneel and still be a queen. And you taught me, Jonah said, kissing her forehead, that a farmer can change the universe if he is stubborn enough. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the new colony, human laughter mixing with the trilling speech of alien children playing in the irrigation ditches. A trade ship roared overhead, carrying grain to a world that had once been an enemy. The war was a memory. The conspiracy was dust. But the wheat was growing. Kale turned in his arms. She looked at him with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with a lifetime of waiting. Are you going to invite me in? She asked, a playful arch to her eyebrow. Or do I have to besiege the kitchen? Jonah laughed. He opened the screen door. Come in, he said. I put the coffee on, and I think there is some stew left. She smiled, squeezed his hand, and stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold, shutting out the dark, leaving only the warmth of the light inside. The galaxy kept spinning. Empires would rise and fall, but on a quiet frontier world, a human farmer and a former warlord sat down at a scarred oak table, broke bread, and were finally perfectly home.